Types of paint evidence. I mentioned before that the most common type of paint evidence is automobile paint. For automobile paint, there's a minimum of 4 layers. You'll always have an electrocoat primer, a primer surfacer, a base coat, and a clear coat. I'll talk about those 4 layers in the next slide. The PDQ, you should remember this from your databases lecture. Databases paint samples for comparison. So car manufacturers don't make their own binders and paints. They purchase them from other companies. Those companies in turn purchase their binders from some manufacturer. They'll purchase their additives from a different manufacturer. They'll purchase their pigments from a different manufacturer. They'll purchase whatever, from some combination of different manufacturers. That separate company will mix them according to certain standards. Then they'll sell them to the automobile company. Any one of these suppliers, depending on market factors, can change, and can change with very, very little notice, and can change in very geographically selective ways, depending on who has sanctions with who has tariffs with who the current administrative leaders are in a given country, and what the political interchange between these places are. Has there been a natural disaster around one pigment making plant and not another? Is the cost of extracting something, did that suddenly go up, so you have to change the pigment in the first place to make it look the same but actually comes from a different thing? These things change all the time, and there's a litany of reasons why the automobile manufacturers can have a very differently composed paint with basically no notice. These factors are also variable, and the factors themselves are poorly databased. Like there's news articles and stuff. If a hurricane or a tornado hit a major pigment factory, or a region where you know that there's a major pigment factory or a binder factory, then yeah, you can find that. But it's not like there's a database for destroyed pigment factories. So these are very, very, very changeable. So it's important that places like the PDQ are able to have a huge database of the same type of looking paints from the same type of cars over different years, makes, models from different plants, so that you can characterize all these different permutations. The PDQ does not tell you where anything comes from. It just tells you these are all the different type of paint signatures you can find on a 2009 four-door Honda Civic that was manufactured in South Carolina and sold in Newton, Massachusetts. That's what it does. This database, because everybody who looks at the database has to also contribute to the database, it is very, very, very robust and very, very frequently updated. This is one of the most easily kept up-to-date databases that we have. These 4 coats, as I mentioned before, you have an electrocoat primer, a primer surfacer, a base coat, and finally a clear coat. And this is to surface. So metal over here. The electrocoat primer, you have this sort of bath of primer solution. It's like a binder kind of a solution, and you apply an electric charge through that solution, and you dip the metal frame of the car through this solution. And the electrical charge will help those pigments, specially designed pigments of the binder molecule, the primer molecule, to bind pretty inextricably from the metal. It's extremely hard to chip primer off of metal without also taking a bunch of metal off with it. The primer surfacer you apply after that. This is highly pigmented and it moderates the color appearance. It also smooths out the seams in the electrocoat. So the electrocoat's pretty thin, and all of those seams from like welding the different parts of the car together will still show. This primer surfacer smooths those out so you can't see all of those weld spots. And it'll also help tone the color appearance. So the next coat, the base coat, let's pretend it is candy apple red. Like lipstick, fingernail polish, apple red. If you have a primer surfacer that has a white pigment to it, that red might show up just a skosh pastel. If you have a yellow primer surfacer color under it, it'll look a little bit like an orangey red. If you have a blue primer surfacer under it, it'll look like a maroonish, purplish kind of a red. It'll moderate that color that you're going to put on in the base coat. The base coat is the overwhelming contributor to what you perceive as the overall color of the car. The binder built into this base coat is usually acrylic based. That's a plastic kind of water based base coat. It is not water soluble though, and it is not oil soluble either. This is what you're going to have a lot of additives added into. So if you think about it, you don't see many just like flat colored cars. You do with white. That was really trendy for a few years when the iPhone came out, actually. But overall, there's usually some sort of a glimmer or a sheen or a sparkle or something when you look really close at that paint. And those are going to come from additives that you add to the base coat. Those are built into the base coat. Mica can give you like this sort of pearlescent sort of a quality. If you put in little specks of aluminum, it'll give it a very glittery kind of appearance. This is where you're going to add UV protection chemicals as well. Finally, you'll add a clear coat, which adds gloss, durability, and just sort of makes it look shiny and new and pretty. It improves its overall appearance. Any kind of defects that might have occurred during the first 3 steps will get hidden by having a really glossy coat put over top too. Since it's going to reflect light away, that kind of obscures little problems. This might be made of acrylic or polyurethane. The second most common type of paint evidence in forensics is architectural paint. That's just, regular old house paint. Regular old house paint, though, is super, super, super diverse. You might use one type of paint on your bedroom walls, a different on your bathroom walls, a different type on your kitchen walls, especially if you do a lot of cooking in your kitchen. You want something that's perhaps a lot tougher so that you can scrub it down after you've been frying something, right? The outside of your house is going to have a very different formulation because it's exposed to the elements. What you paint the floor of your front porch with is going to be different than all the others because they're going to have different additives. There's not any kind of meaningful standardization of these paints that I'm aware of, at least. So the type of paints that you buy from one company might have a pretty different type of formulation from a different company, and they might not be keeping as robust notes as automobile manufacturers are. Typically, when you find paint evidence from architectural paint, there's many layers of paint. You'll often have a primer layer and then a paint layer. These days, you might have primer and color layers sort of built into one, but even still, people will often put down multiple coats of it to emphasize the impact of the color. When you paint a wall, generally speaking, inside of your house, you don't chip off all the old paint first, you just paint right over it, right? So you'll oftentimes, especially for older structures, find multiple colors of paint, multiple layers of paint. You might find multiple layers of different colors of paint, or you might find multiple layers of the same color of paint, or what seem to be the same color of paint but have very, very small differences. Those might not be able to be easy to differentiate by eye, but using more sophisticated techniques you may be able to characterize them.